Today, you'll hear from Jane Austen's own great niece in an exclusive interview that reveals worldwide information not heard elsewhere that unlocks secrets concerning Jane Austen and life at Chawton House. Listen until the end to hear the exciting news. The past isn't silent, it's buried. Welcome to Hidden Heroines of History. I'm your host, Gayvin Powers, a published author, award-winning screenwriter, and storyteller who brings women's history to life. Caroline Jane Knight is the fifth great niece of Jane Austen and the last of Jane's nieces to grow up at Chawton House on her family's ancestral estate where Jane herself lived, wrote, and published her most famous works. Following a childhood steeped in family heritage and tradition in the heart of Jane's literary legacy, Caroline is this generation's voice for her family. She shares her childhood in Chawton and her most famous great-aunt at events around the world, both in person and virtually, while preserving her family heritage for future generations through the Austen Knight Family Archive. Caroline is the author of Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage. She's also founder and chair of the Jane Austen Literary Foundation and creator of Jane Austen's Niece, where she invites audiences to step into Jane's world through her family's eyes. You can find her at janeaustensniece.substack.com and austenheritage.com. Let's go ahead and welcome Caroline. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So, Caroline, I had to bring you on. I loved interviewing you over the summer, and I read your book, Jane and Me, My Austen Heritage, and it was so helpful. And then I just re-listened to it right before doing this again, and it's such a great piece of writing. You're so vulnerable in it, which is very, very hard for a writer to be. You did it beautifully. And I really feel like the book resonates with a lot of our ancestors, but it's also a book that resonates with modern readers, modern women, and the experience is very universal. So I would love if you wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about that. And I also noticed that there was a big tie-in with Sense and Sensibility, and that just gutted me in a lot of ways. So I'd like to turn it over to you, and please share with our listeners your experience of writing that book.
Thank you. Well, I, as you know, spent the first 18 years of my life living at Chawton House, the ancestral home of the Knight family, which was inherited by Jane Austen's brother, on the condition he changed his name to Knight, which is why we're Knights and not Austens. And I have to say, growing up, and it's on the Chawton estate that Jane lived for the last 8 years of her life, and that's where she had the most productive, period of her writing career. And I think growing up in Chawton, I never ever thought I would write a book. And you may think, well, surely with Jane in the family, we'd all be authors. But actually it was something that, when I was a kid, it was sort of, I don't know, with Jane in the family, we've got our writer, if you know what I mean. And I always thought if I wrote, we're only going to be compared to Jane. And that's a comparison we're all going to lose every time. It didn't make me kind of think I've got to be a writer. Jane taught me that I've got to keep to my own style and go on in my own way and be what I'm supposed to be. But I didn't think it would be a writer. And in that 25 years, I had never told anybody that I came from Chawton, that I was related to Jane Austen. It was something in my adult years. The loss of Chawton really, it hurt me. And I was 18 when that happened. And I just didn't want to talk about it. I didn't want to remember it. I didn't want to talk about what to me was just loss. But then in 2013 was the 200-year anniversary of the publishing of Pride and Prejudice. And it had been 25 years since we left. And that anniversary was just a moment in time where Jane Austen was just, celebrated through the mainstream media as much as the sort of specialist, Jane Austen interest areas. And it just started a chain of events that just got me thinking. First of all, it's been 25 years and I am still so upset about it, obviously not now, but back in 2013, that I can't even talk about this. And I've got to sort that out. This is ridiculous. Chawton House is now, it's a building that more and more people are visiting, that it's become a public building. It's become world famous. I need to deal with my own emotions around this. But also I began to realise that from a kind of social history point of view, Jane Austen and her family's story is documented over the centuries. The last significant documentation of that was in 1913, when Montague Knight, one of my ancestors, wrote Chawton Manor and its own as a family history. But there's nothing from the 20th century. And we're the last of the Austens to know Chawton House. I grew up with it when it was still our family home. It wasn't a public building. Yes, we actually had visitors come in all summer because Granny ran a tea room from the Great Hall. So I was talking to
Mhm.
Jane Austen fans all summer and people coming in. We used to host a lot of events as well. The majority of the house was a private home, and we were still living, following traditions that the family had done for a long time, still hearing the family stories, still using the same books in the family library that Jane would have known. And I sat at the same dining room table as her and ate from the same Wedgwood dinner service. And, as I said, this was a continuation of life from Jane's time in Chawton. And I just had a sense of, I value Montagu's book so highly as
Mhm.
it's such a it's such a gift that he and William Austen Leigh took the time to put that together. For all of those reasons, I've got a first-hand account here that if I don't share it is going to be lost forever. When I
Right.
actually came to write the book, it was something that I had no intention of being vulnerable in it. That never occurred to me that I would be doing that. I knew people were visiting Chawton, and I just wanted to paint a picture of Chawton House as a family home. I wanted to be able, if we're sitting down having a cup of coffee and I'm just telling you about it. But when I started writing, it's like my fingers just took over. And certainly because in the middle of the book, my grandfather died, and
Yeah.
we had to give up Chawton House after 450 years. Chawton House no longer going to be somewhere that the Knight family would be able to live. And that was very difficult. I sort of thought that would be the end of the book. When I started, I just
Mhm.
thought I was going to talk about Chawton, getting into what the impact of that loss was and how that impact has impacted my life and why I
Mhm.
didn't tell anybody for 25 years. I never
Right.
imagined that I would do that. Culturally, I'm English. We're not necessarily
Mhm.
ordinarily, we don't allow ourselves to be that vulnerable, but it's just what came out. It's just what came out.
And that's what makes the book so good too, is because you allowed yourself to be vulnerable. And by being vulnerable, you were able to connect with so many other people who have either been housing insecure or had ancestors that lost their homes or are facing that today. You really made it personal and really tapped into this group of people, especially women. Historically, this is a horrific experience. You even touch on it with Sense and Sensibility. Jane experienced this. This is generational.
Absolutely.
And she wrote about it, and then you're living it.
It's not just peculiar to our family. That's been,
Right.
unfortunately, particularly for women, that's been there a lot for until recent years, where women
Right.
were absolutely dependent on other people, and women's housing wasn't their own decision. They didn't have their
Mhm.
own agency over things like that. And you're right, the fact that, because actually what the feedback I get when I do events and I meet my readers,
Mhm.
there's always something, and of course people connect with different things. People will say, I moved house when I was a child, or we moved country, or people
Mhm.
absolutely can relate to that.
Mhm.
And you're right in saying that doing that, whilst people may not be able to, of course, personally relate to growing up in a house like Chawton House, they can relate
Mhm.
to me as
Yes.
a young woman feeling completely lost and not knowing who I am and where I go from here and find my
Absolutely.
own identity. All of that, I think, is, of course, that's a very common human experience, isn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's what makes it so good.
As you, well, thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
And as you say, there's parallels all the way through. There's parallels all the way through, isn't there? As you say, because
Mhm.
you've got in Sense and Sensibility, which is Jane's first published novel. Sense and Sensibility
Mhm.
starts with, of course, Mr. Dashwood dying, John Dashwood inheriting, and with the intention that he's going to help his sisters, and then his wife, Fanny Dashwood, just is one of my favourite pieces of Jane Austen's writing. I really think she launched with a bang, didn't she, with that novel? Because it's just right into just something that's so funny and so wittily written. It's fantastic. But the upshot is that Fanny dissuades her husband from helping her sisters, and then they're sort of a bit destitute, and they're now absolutely beholden to some relation or other rescuing them. And in Jane's own life, after their father died, the Austen ladies, as we call them collectively, they were living with Brother Frank in Southampton. They didn't have their own home. And in
Mhm.
1809, through the generosity of a relation, which was Jane's brother Edward, my fourth great grandfather, who had inherited all the Knight's estates, he offered them a cottage in Chawton. And just like
Yeah.
the Dashwoods moving into Barton Cottage, or for the first time since these difficult years, they had their own home and a cottage that they could call their own.
Yes, the parallels are amazing going back and forth with Jane and with Sense and Sensibility. And you told me a really great story over the summer where you were speculating.
It was Edward, obviously, who offered the property. So Edward,
Yes.
yes, his wife died. So Edward's wife, Elizabeth, who'd be my fourth great grandmother, she died in October 1808. Now,
Okay.
George Austen had died in 1806, so the ladies had been living in Southampton with brother Frank and Mary. They'd been there for sort of 3 years, and in those years, I can only assume because they were in quite cramped conditions in Southampton, that the Austen ladies were actually quite transient, and they had a lot of friends and relations and people to visit, and they did. And of course, in those days, if you visited someone, you'd be there for 2 months. The travel was so difficult, or you'd be there for weeks. You didn't just go and see someone for the weekend. Said they were very, very transient. And Elizabeth died in October 1808. And at the beginning of 1809, Edward offered his mother and his sisters the cottage in Chawton. He offered them a choice of Chawton and Gomersham, and they chose Chawton. 18 months later, Jane's first novel to be published is Sense and Sensibility. And there in the opening chapters, you've got this scene, haven't you, of a wife stopping her husband from helping his sisters. And on the face of it, there's a parallel there that you just can't help thinking. Jane's kind of captured that in her opening novel. It would just appear to be such an obvious clue or such an obvious alignment. And there are ways in which it is the most compelling theory as to why they weren't housed earlier on. The only thing with the theory that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, that I'm not sure actually means it stands up, is if the Austen ladies had needed housing for some time and they then got it from Edward, would Jane actually have immortalised that so clearly in her first book and potentially humiliated Edward? But who knows?
And it might be in one of those 3,000 letters that are missing from the Austen family after she passed.
Absolutely. Indeed. But we certainly have no evidence to think that there was the publishing of Sense and Sensibility caused any drama or that Edward was upset. But it's a nice thought, though, isn't it?
It is.
As I said, that Jane got the last laugh.
The podcast is featuring women that were forgotten in history, and obviously Jane is this global icon now, so it doesn't seem like she's lost or forgotten. But there was a time after she passed away for 12 years where her books were out of print. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so it's absolutely true that after she died, her books were out of print for 12 years. So she was certainly not on the radar of the publishing industry. And Jane, interestingly, only traditionally published one of her novels, which is Pride and Prejudice. All of the others were published on commission, which in her day was sort of the modern, it's a bit like self-publishing now. So of course she wasn't jumping onto, she wasn't doing it herself, but it meant that she paid for the publishing. But it meant she kept the copyright, she kept creative control. It was up to her when things were republished, and she got the profit. So she was taking the risk, but she got control and profit, and as I said, kept the ownership, the copyrights. So when Jane died, and Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, which were published posthumously, they were also published on commission. So the family kept the copyrights of those as well. So in actual fact, 5 of the copyrights, all of them, except for Pride and Prejudice, were kept in the family. And yes, it did take 12 years until another publisher called Bentley, he wanted to republish her work. So he actually bought the copyrights from the family of the 5, and he bought the copyright of Pride and Prejudice from Egerton, the publisher who published it. So whilst, yes, that happened, and so there was 12 years and Egerton didn't republish Pride and Prejudice, I don't really know why, I have to say. That's one of the things I've tried to, if anybody can shed any light on that, I'd be interested, because I have tried. I don't think Jane was forgotten in terms of the readers, because her work was still listed in the travelling libraries. And in those days, people borrowed books from each other a lot. There was an awful lot of people that couldn't afford books. They were a luxury. They were expensive. So it's something that it was very common for a book to have actually quite a journey through different people's hands over years. In those days, it was different. So I think her work would very much have continued being read, which and loved, which is I'm assuming why Bentley, because he was a,
Mm-hmm.
a publisher, he was a businessman, why, there must have been a reason that he thought, no, hang on a second, these need to be republished. And as I said, I
Right.
can only assume it was because she didn't die in terms of
Mm-hmm.
popularity and readership. It was only the publishing world that wasn't paying any attention.
Well, I'm glad that he got on board and kept her spirit alive and her words.
Absolutely. And we talk about this very common question: how did Jane end up being the phenomenon she is today? How did
Mm-hmm.
this happen? Because it is so extraordinary. There are lots and lots and lots of different reasons. But
Right.
Bentley deserves some credit. He absolutely deserves
I
credit, because without him it might never have happened. And he
right.
really was the first that thought after her death, no, this work needs to carry on.
And that's part of why she's still relevant today. I believe she still is very relevant today with women in our journeys and the way we go through life and the hard choices that we have to make. But I'd love to hear from you why you think that she's a modern woman and still relevant today.
I think partly the way Jane writes, I think the way she writes does make us feel her
Mm-hmm.
in the experience of reading her work.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult for me because I've grown up with her. There's never a moment in my life where I haven't known who Jane Austen is, or I haven't, if you know what I mean. That was there since before I
Yes.
could talk. So I don't know whether my views on her in some ways are representative of everyone else's. I can't necessarily
Mm-hmm.
separate that out. But in my
Mm-hmm.
mind, I can read other fiction and I don't necessarily hear the author in quite a strong way as I do when I'm reading Jane Austen works. There are other authors that do it fantastically as well. But when
Mm-hmm.
I'm reading her work, because of the way she writes, as I said, I can get such a sort of vivid picture of who I think she is. And I think that one of the most compelling things, as you said, is we've got someone who, even though she's in a different time period to us, her writing is about the minutiae, isn't it, of human relationships,
Mm-hmm.
about dynamics, about power, about those sorts of things. And it doesn't matter what century you live in, those things, that's humans, that's human nature, and those things exist. And I think it gives us a picture of Jane's life, even though we're imagining so much of it, because we actually know
Mm-hmm.
very little about her and her actual life. But what we do know, coupled with that work, I think can give us an idea that her life and the dynamics that would have been going on in her family, the challenges of, yes, being beholden to other people for certain things, which all of us are in life, the
For
challenge of
sure.
family expectations that don't necessarily match what we as individuals want, the challenges of having to make your way in a world that isn't necessarily set up for you. And one of the things that Jane had, which we talk about, of course, of those days, is agency. It may not have been her choice where she lived, it may not have been her choice, but it was her choice what she thought, and it was
Mm-hmm.
her choice what she did. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that I admire most about Jane Austen as a woman is she was in a situation where her skill and her passion and the person she knew that she was supposed to be, a
Mm-hmm.
writer, had their own thoughts and actually was questioning
Mm-hmm.
potentially, things like slavery, did have views on these things. She had a point of
Mm-hmm.
view. She was plugged into what was going on. She was far more actually astute and aware, I think, than people necessarily know she would be, um or that the casual observer may understand that she was. And she found a way of expressing her voice, of being who she was supposed to be, of not shutting that side of herself off, but within the confines
Mm-hmm.
of the society she lived in, the family she lived in. Jane
Yes.
Austen was someone who achieved what she needed to achieve, but she wasn't a rebel who was running around causing trouble, causing embarrassment. And for me personally, and obviously having grown up in that shadow, maybe that's why it's such a part of me, is I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a great skill, because I want to be, I want to do the same. I want to be true to myself. But I don't
Right.
need to do that in a way that alienates my family. And there is a line to tread in life, isn't there? Of
Yes.
balancing our need to be, and she wanted to be a loved sister and aunt and daughter, and she was. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that is such a good balance. That is really admirable.
And especially in that time period, because the expectation was for her not to be a writer, and was for her to get married and to have pressures to take care of her family and to be a married wife and have children and babies. And even her living a different lifestyle could be considered very dangerous to other women because, heaven forbid, they're not going along with society's norms back then. So she really, in my opinion, had to have a very strong sense of self, a very strong sense of what she wanted, what she loved, which clearly she loved writing. And her family knew it because when they finally moved to Chawton, they made sure that she had time to write. And that is huge back then because a lot of families weren't supportive of women that were writers as well. That is a really beautiful thing that the family supported her also.
And that started very, very early. At Steventon, that started. And we can tell, I mean, the mere fact, obviously, that all of Jane's writing from about 12 years onwards, all of that teenage writing exists today and is in, three volumes, the Juvenilia, in museums in England. And that in itself says an awful lot, because I don't know about you, but my parents haven't kept everything I wrote since I was 12. I mean, you know what I mean? That's just because why would you? So I think that in itself, the writings of all of the other Austen children, they're not bound into volumes and anywhere. So you sort of think that they must have. And of course, we know that Jane was making up stories, and because obviously without any television or any entertainment at all, everybody sort of did something, didn't they, to entertain in the evening or in the afternoons or whatever. And Jane would tell stories, and she was encouraged, and her father would encourage her to read books in his library, and she was well educated and properly educated. So that sort of encouragement of her to be her was there right from these, which, as you say, is extraordinary. So when Jane moved to Chawton, one of the things, so Fanny Knight, Jane's niece, writes in her diary in 1806 what fun they're having going through all the family archives at Chawton House of the Knight family, which obviously Edward, when he inherited, but one of the other things they would have discovered at Chawton House was the ghosts, because now every house has a grey lady. So you kind of think, well, does every house, because we've got a grey lady, and the grey lady walks in what now, because Chawton House is now an open building, so it's easy to talk about it in modern terms that people would understand. The exhibition rooms upstairs and the tapestry gallery next to it, that's where the Grey Lady is said to walk. And in my childhood, there were many stories. I never saw her myself, but there were many stories of people who absolutely swore that they had seen her. I've also heard in passing stories of a poltergeist in one of the rooms. But I have to say that's a story that hasn't been. The Grey Lady is mentioned at different times throughout our history, whereas the poltergeist isn't. So I'm not entirely sure whether that was somebody in more modern times just being naughty or not. I don't know. But the Grey Lady certainly was in there in longer times. And interestingly enough, talking about ghosts, I quite recently have been contacted. I'm not going to say his name because I don't want, you know what I mean? I haven't got his permission to do that. But I've been contacted by somebody who believes that Jane's ghost is in Steventon Church. Believes that he has recordings, video recordings, where you can sort of see this spirit, and that she talks, and that. So I obviously cannot verify that in any way at all. But as I said, there is certainly a belief, I'm told, footage, as I said, that Jane is in Steventon Church.
So Jane, what do you really think? Tell me. Tell me about Fanny.
The other thing, of course, when I was thinking about churches, so Jane was a devout Christian. She also grew up with a father who was a vicar, and she grew up in Steventon, in the rectory, which is not far from the church. And the church was her father's place of work. So it would have been somewhere that she wasn't somebody who was just in church on a Sunday going to the service. She would have been in that church just for services, but he would have been in there preparing, doing all sorts of things. I'm sure it was an environment that she was extremely comfortable with, familiar with, and she grew up as a clergyman's daughter, which would have given her, it just would have meant that in the village she was somebody of recognition. And of course, in her work, She actually
Mm-hmm.
plays with the clergy a bit, doesn't she? She has fun with clergyman characters in, and that often will raise sort of questions about sort of, so does that mean that she didn't really like the clergy? I don't perceive it like that. I actually think it's the familiarity
Mm-hmm.
that creates. They're just people, aren't they? So of course, just like
They
you do
are.
today, there would have been this extraordinary array of funny characters in different ways, and she's pulled on that. But I think it's
Yeah.
actually her closeness to the church, and to, as I said, and having known so many clergymen in her life and grown up in
Right.
the heart of it, that probably actually gives her the confidence to do that,
Mhm.
with those characters.
Yes. And well, you get Edward Ferrars to Mr. Collins. So you've got
Exactly.
a nice array right there.
Yes.
Yes. Would you like to talk about the exciting news announcement that you have about what's coming up next with you and Jane Austen and the Austen world?
I will. So, very, very exciting news that is being announced today. I'm very active in terms of doing events and storytelling, and my book was actually just the start of me trying to use this heritage that I have, help people perhaps connect with Jane in a different way through her family,
Mm-hmm.
and really sort of step into her world through the eyes of her family, which is it's a different perspective, isn't it? And a different experience.
Mm-hmm.
And over the years, I have built up quite an archive of photographs that I've digitized and materials and all the stories that I've written. I write every single week on Jane Austen's Niece online. And so I've sort of amassed all of this material, including some stories and things from other family members.
Mm-hmm.
And I am now going to take that side of my work a step further. And I think that, all of us, when we're researching, when we're sort of trying to look back at, things that have happened in Jane's life or Chawton House in 1900 or whatever anyone's looking at. Now, there are a handful of me and my family who grew up in Chawton House, who are still alive today, who still are
Mm-hmm.
the holders of all of those memories and stories. And I'm going to create an archive. And my intention is to create the most complete picture there's ever been of life at Chawton House. That would be something that for future generations and for researchers now and for the general public, because not only are we Jane Austen's family, and so there's some
Mm-hmm.
historical relevance there, but we're
Mm-hmm.
also an example of a family in the last hundreds of years of a
Mm-hmm.
social and economic system that maintained, and that system had been going on for 900 years. We, give or take, 450 years old. My memory is the last 20 years of that. And just from a social history point of view, of actually what was life like inside these ancestral homes in those last 20 years, that's our, we've got that first hand knowledge, and I need to record that in a different way, so it is a resource, as I said, for future generations.
Absolutely. And you mentioned before that Montague was the last one that recorded until you, and that's a very, very long time. Do you want to talk about that? Because bridging Montague to you, to what you're bringing in, and then with your other relatives, this is going to be a huge project that's going to bridge a lot of information for people.
Yes, because as you said, Montague Knight, so one of my ancestors, he was the 13th squire of Chawton
Mhm.
House, and he wrote with William Austen Leigh Chawton Manor and its owners a family history,
Mhm.
which you can buy a copy on Amazon if people want to read that. It's fascinating. For
Mhm.
me, that is such a treat. The fact that they went to the effort of documenting
Mhm.
hundreds of years of Chawton House and all the different branches of the Knight family that have owned it and who these people were, and it's full of images, it's full of pictures of things that they obviously considered important, which are now in our family. These are our heirlooms. And to me, that book is so precious. And I'm so grateful that they went to the effort of doing that. It's such a treat for us now, because without that, we just wouldn't know. There's so many questions unanswered. And so, yes, that was partly, as I said, what actually spurred me on to write Jane and me, my Austen Heritage, and
Mhm.
actually start this whole journey, as there was that
Mhm.
realization that it hasn't happened since then. And I have the opportunity, and we have the opportunity to do that, as I said, and leave that gift for future
Mhm.
generations of our family and obviously the wider historians and Jane Austen community.
I think that's going to be an amazing gift to leave future generations and people who are still interested in Jane Austen. Look at how she's grown over the 250 years. And so you're leaving another major piece that's just going to help along the lines. And then you're going to be one of those people that they go, oh, and then there's Caroline Jane Knight, and look at all the archives she did, and then they'll be studying you, which will be wild.
Which will be wild, exactly.
Jane Knights are going to love it. Absolutely love it. If Jane were here today on her 250th birthday and you could say anything to her, what would you say?
It would be a mixture of well done. No, I'd have to start with a massive round of applause. You know what I mean? Well done. I mean, my goodness.
Just give a round of applause. Yes, absolutely. Well done, Jane.
Well done. Well done. I'd be fist pumping, if you know what I mean. We'd be having a good high five. I mean, what a phenomenal achievement. And thank you would be the second thing, isn't it? Because, you know, not only did she leave a phenomenal gift for humanity, she, on a personal level, I mean, she's, you know, the impact on her, my life would be completely different without her, as would so many people's lives would be completely different without her. And it is extraordinary because I work with the global Jane Austen community. It is extraordinary the diverse range of people whose lives are completely changed by Jane Austen. Whether they're whether they're people that now run Jane Austen festivals, you know, or whether they're writers, or whether they're actors, or they're theatre producers, or there's just this enormous array. People online who make a living out of blogging out of Jane Austen, you know, people who seamstresses who make all the costumes. I mean, there's just an enormous array of different trades, different people with different skills across the world, as I said, whose lives have been touched, enhanced, and changed by Jane Austen. None more so than mine, if I'm honest, you know what I mean, and her entire family, because her fame is completely, you know, her fame particularly, I mean, obviously growing up in Chawton was an experience in itself, and she brought thousands of visitors a year, and I spent my summer weekends talking to Jane Austen lovers. But now my entire life revolves around Jane Austen, between Jane Austen's niece, doing that and doing events and writing and everything else, between the archive project that people will sort of see unfold next year, and the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. That's my world. You know, it's all about Jane Austen, and I am so lucky, and I love it. I love it. So it would be well done and thank you, I think, is what I'd be saying to her.
That's great. And what a great life, too. Let's go ahead and toast to Aunt Jane. Happy birthday. Happy 250th Jane Austen. Thank you so much for joining me, Caroline. I've loved talking with you, and I wish you the best in all of your endeavors.
Thank you very much. It's been lovely talking to you. Bye-bye.
Lovely talking to you, too. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this, like, share, and subscribe. We have more amazing episodes planned. You can listen to them on the Hidden Heroines of History podcast on YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, and iHeartRadio.